So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one because basically I made some predictions last week about what the meta was going to look like, and it ended up being mostly correct, so there's not a whole lot of reason to change things. Obviously, we have gone through the Ascent of Targon Qualifier at this point, and I wanted to talk about just a couple of shakeups to the tier list that happened, a couple of things that got added and solidified their spot. I got rid of the unsort of listed decks because I listed them. Lulu really has fallen to the wayside so much that I just took it off the tier list. We have seen Lulu decks pretty much hard underperform across the ladder, and I think that Lee Sin and Shen Fiora have really taken over as sort of the only Ionia decks in the format. I don't have any Heimerdinger lists listed here, as we still haven't really seen them pick up a lot of traction, though if they were to be listed, they would probably be in tier 3. I just don't love the late game that Heimer is bringing. It used to be able to, if you top deck the Heimer late in the game, you could still pump out a bunch of elusives, and if your opponent was at, half life or even a little bit higher, you could generally finish them off with a flurry of elusive turrets and then a little bit of burn spells to get over the top. Nowadays, you're not really getting that done. You're losing to the more late game decks, and we are in a pretty late game meta. So up in tier 1, we have these 5 decks. These were actually the 5 most popular decks at the North American Qualifier. Not necessarily the most popular in the top 32, but across the whole thing, Shen Fiora did make its way into this for the top cut popularity contest. I have it down in tier 2. I'm still not super duper sold on it 100%. I think that some of the adaptations that we're going to see with players out of their Ionia going into this weekend does mean that Shen Fiora is going to fall off the wagon just a little bit, but I do think it is probably the best board-centric Demacia deck at the moment. I definitely like it more than the Elite deck that I had been talking about, which did not have a great showing this weekend. Scouts also didn't have a great showing, but the power level is still arguably there. Zombie Ash performed very admirably. It gets to stay in tier 2. Frostbite midrange performed better than I expected, but didn't do anything crazy. Deep was sort of the dark horse of the weekend. It didn't really show up that much in Top Cut, but its performance could not be understated. Of course, discard aggro still rounds out your 3 aggro lineups extremely well, although typically now the 3 aggro lineups are going for discard aggro, Shen Fiora, and then sometimes we're seeing Endure, sometimes we're seeing Nightfall aggro. Nightfall is a deck that, I've got it down in tier 3. It's still very popular, but I've made it pretty clear that I'm not the biggest fan of this deck. I really like it when you have Atrocity as a win con. There are some versions that are now on 2 Cygnus the Moonstalker and 2 Atrocity, but a lot of the lists that we were seeing for a while were on 1 Cygnus the Moonstalker and no Atrocity, and the only times we ever saw them win on camera were actually when they drew that one of Cygnus, which was not sort of the proposed win condition of the deck, or the players wouldn't have only been playing 1 copy. But Nightfall just feels like a camera shy deck, so because I am a caster, I'm kind of going off of the matches that I've seen, and from what I've seen, Nightfall has performed extremely poorly. Obviously, it's been picking up wins to get them to the top 4 in the finals points where I get to see them, but then when we get to the finals, you're finally on camera, and your Nightfall deck gets 2-0'd. That's something we saw happen a couple of times, so still not super sold on the deck, but it does seem to be overtaking, if not competing with Endure Spiders, for the aggro slot for the Shadow Isle deck anyway. But yeah, outside of that, we're still in this kind of polarizing meta. There's a lot of aggro, there's a lot of late game control decks, there's a lot of mid-range decks. I think that War Mothers is still probably one of my favorite decks, but I want to talk about the IQ qualifier, sort of the big open tournament of the weekend, because you guys don't want to hear me. I'm not doing a tournament tactician for the guys that are in the Team Liquid the Ascent of Targon Invitational, right? They've already submitted their deck lists. Even if they saw this video, it'd be too late to change anything. But no, these videos are for you, the common man who is now in the Team IQ qualifier for this weekend, sort of the big open tournament, and it's going to be unified. And I think that we are currently at a point where we're probably seeing the least diversity between a unified format and a region lock format. There are a couple of pivotal cards in every region that we just don't see players getting rid of. For example, Endure Spiders and Bald Eagle, which I don't think I actually placed here because it's not super popular, but I thought those were like 2 Shadow Isle Failure decks that you could actually run next to each other, but Glimpse Beyond is really important for both of them. I know it sounds a little weird to say that for Bald Eagle, but you do kind of want it to dodge those Obliterate abilities onto your Anivia. And of course, Endure Spiders, it's just a quintessential card of the deck. It does so much that the deck wants to do. Every Bilgewater deck at this point is running Petty Officer. It's just a versatile card. Piltover Zon has pretty much fallen off the map, so we're not really seeing that anymore. Ionia, everybody needs Deny. You know what I'm talking about? There's just not a lot that you can actually get away with in terms of overlap. You can still pretty much run a deep deck and any other Bilgewater deck if that's a route that you want to go, but I think that Shadow Isle Freljord is such a powerful combination right now that that's not the line that a lot of people are going to want to go. So yeah, I think that for the most part, a card lock tournament is going to look a lot like a region lock at this point in time. That's pretty likely to change when we actually do get our balance patch, I believe, next week, so keep that in mind. This is the last tournament tactician of the format. format. That one kind of flew by, you know, only having 2 weeks between the balance changes, but I'm excited to see what happens. I know we're expecting some hush nerfs, maybe a compensation buff to Ezreal, as it has hard fallen off, but not completely. There were still more Heimerdinger, or there were still more Ezreal decks in the top 64 of the Ascent of Targon qualifier than there were Heimerdinger decks, albeit by a very slim margin. But that's really all I wanted to say this week. I would recommend, if you're really looking for an in-depth analysis, go back and watch last week's Tournament Tactician, because I think I got a lot right last week. There's not a whole lot that's changed. These 5 decks are far and away the most popular. Targon Allegiance is actually looking a lot more like Luxsoul than it used to. It's basically just take out the Lux and the Remembrance, put in Leona and Ravoon, and then find some room for some Mountain Scryers. But Targon Allegiance is now just looking basically like Lux Ace Soul. You know, Zombie Ash is still sort of the off-the-wall meta pick that players are picking up on. But yeah, for the most part, everything that I said last week still holds true. There haven't been any major shakeups in the meta. Some of the Fight Night decks are interesting to look at this week. We're looking at Karma Dragons, a couple of new Lee Sin decks. But yeah, I think for the most part, those are going to be things that the higher level players are screwing around with for the Invitational, not so much something that you're going to run into an abundance of in an open qualifier like the IQ tournament. So go ahead and check out last week's if you're looking for a more in-depth rundown of the meta. This one, I'm just kind of here to tell you everything's been par for the course, smooth sailing, no major shakeups, just some slight adjustments to the tier list. As always, this will be linked down below. But that's really it for this weekend's Tournament Tactician. Thank you guys so much for watching it. I know it was short and kind of late, but I wanted to make sure that there was nothing crazy coming out of the Fight Night deck list, at least something that would pick up in a major way this weekend. And I did want to inform you that Region Lock and Card Lock basically looking like the same format for the time being, but we'll see how that actually ends up going next week. So until next time, everybody, my name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.